Chapters 13 and 14 of A Fool There Was by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Going. John Schuyler had come to be a big man and a broad one, big in the great things of life that sometimes are so small, big in the small things of life that sometimes are so great. Broad of mind as well as broad of shoulders he was. 40 years of age now, his hair, by the habit of thought, was tinged with gray at the temples, yet skin and complexion were as those of a boy. Quick in movement, agile, alert, thrilling with vitality and virility, his pleasures were, as they had always been, the pleasures of the great out-of-doors. A yachtsman, his big yawl, the Manana, was known in every club port from Gravesend to Bar Harbor. He motored, he rowed, he played tennis, and golf, and squash, and rackets. He was an expert swimmer, a skillful fencer, a clever boxer. And, more wonderful than the combination of these things, was the fact that he found time away from his work to do them all, and to enjoy them with the youthful, contagious, effervescent enthusiasm of a man of half his age. It showed in his well set up, well poised body. It showed in the expression of his clear-cut bronzed features. It showed in every little shift of pose, every little turn of his well-shaped head, as he stood leaning gracefully against the ledge of the bay window, talking with Blake. For Mrs. Schuyler and Muriel had gone to make ready for the trip to the city and to the dock. "I don't like to leave it, Tom," he said slowly, his eyes roaming over the bright little room. "I don't like to leave it even to hobnob with crowned heads, and to take tea with dukes, earls, princes, and kings, to say nothing of mere lords. My world is right here. And it's all the world I want, Tom. It's bounded on the south by the Sound, on the north by the property of the municipality, on the east and west by somebody else's worlds, and above by eternity." Blake lighted a cigar. "Then what are you going for?" he asked, practically. Schuyler shrugged his shoulders. "I wonder," he replied. "Want me to tell you?" queried the other. "I should be obliged," he said with a smile. "Well," began Blake, placing finger ends to finger ends, judiciously. "In the first place you're ambitious. You like the plaudits of the populace. You see here a chance to get about 1,000,000% on your investment. Whereby you stick 2 months' time and a little effort into the proposition and draw down a position that means sitting beside the chief executive and trying to look as though you knew what he was talking about. Also a chance to live in Washington and cut figure-8s in the diplomatic circles. All of which is perfectly natural, nothing at all to your discredit, and furthermore shows whence come the few good men, who, sticking their heels in, are trying to keep the country from going to the demnition bow-wows. Am I right?" Schuyler watched a little ring of blue smoke rising to the ceiling. "No," he answered, slowly. "You're wrong. I care nothing for the plaudits of the populace. I'm ambitious, in a way, but when that way requires me to leave the people, the things, that I love, then ambition chameleonizes, and I become ambitious authentically. Furthermore, I loathe the climate of Washington, and all the society I want I can find right in my home, with the exception of yourself." "Which is not so much of an exception after all," commented Blake, "because when it comes to sticking around I'm the original young Mr. Glue." "You know, Tom," went on Schuyler, "I don't like to take any chances with a happiness such as mine. I wonder, sometimes, if I really know how happy I am. One can get used to happiness, you know, just as to other things, except unhappiness." "Hum," snorted Blake. "I've got used to that, even. Dad, burn it all, nothing ever goes right with me, except money. And that's no good without the rest. Money is merely an agreeable accessory. To have money and nothing with it is like having an olive and no cocktail to put it in. If I eat what I like, I get sick. I'm always either 40 pounds too heavy or 20 pounds too light. I'm continually dieting or training and wondering why in Sam Hill I'm doing either. I have to live alone, to spend my evening at theaters or clubs. I am a man who would willingly give up all his clubs for one large pair of pink carpet slippers and the theaters for a corpulent, aristocratic Maltese cat with a baritone purr." Schuyler, immersed in his own thoughts, had not been listening. Blake eyed him whimsically. "Ain't I the gabby thing, though?" he remarked at length, and then, "A couple of $1,000,000 for your thoughts, sweet Chuck." "I was thinking how near I came to turning all this down, and how I'm sort of sorry that I didn't." "Nell's better, isn't she?" queried Blake, suddenly. "Better, yes. But not out of danger. Why?" "Why," returned Blake, "it just occurred to me. See here, old man, I've nothing much to do. Can't I stick around here, and then you can take Kate and Muriel with you?" "That's good of you, Tom," said Schuyler, smiling a little. "But a bachelor around a sick room is of about as much use as an elephant at a pink tea. No, Kate and I have talked it all over, and under the conditions, she has decided to stay at home. It'll be mighty hard, though, mighty hard. It must be nearly time to leave." Blake looked at his watch. "9:50," he said. "What time does the train go?" Schuyler did not answer, for just then there entered the room a tall, clean-cut young fellow of 30, dressed with quiet immaculacy. It was Parks, John Schuyler's secretary. To him Schuyler turned. "Is everything ready, Parks?" he asked. "Everything," was the reply. "And the car is waiting." "Mrs. Schuyler?" "Is in the hall." "You have the documents that we selected?" "Here, sir." Parks touched with the fingers of his right hand the little satchel of black seal that he carried beneath his left arm. "How much time have we?" "We should leave within a very few minutes now." "Very well. We'll be right there." As Parks left the room, Blake turned to his friend. "Jack," he exclaimed, "it makes me sore every time I look at you. Why in thunder can't I get in once in a while? Nothing would suit me better than to go over and buy the king a glass of half and half, and mix around with the diplomats, and settle the affairs of nations. But they wouldn't let me send cucumber seeds to the mattress-faced constituency of Skaneateles County if I should offer to pay for the job. I've got everything I don't want, except the measles, and everything I do want, I can't get. I want a home. What have I? A box stall with nobody in it but a man to curry me, and he's curried me so often that he's lost all respect for me. I want to stop being merely ornamental and become useful. But when I say so, everyone hands me the jocose and jibing jeer, and proceeds to lock up anything that seems to have any relation whatsoever to industry, commerce, or utility of any kind. And the best I can get is the festive roof garden, the broad speedway, and the bounding wave. I wish I were running this universe. I ain't mentioning no names, but there's a certain svelte party on my left, whose initials are J.S., who wouldn't have a monopoly on all the good things in this world." Schuyler, filling his cigar case from a silver humidor on the sideboard, laughed. "There's nothing the matter with you, Tom," he said, assuringly, "except that you have too much time and too much money. Stop your kicking." Blake grinned. "Let me rave if I want to," he requested. "Let me have a good time. You know as well as I do that I don't mean it, and you know that I'm more glad for your success and happiness and prosperity than I would be for my own. And that's being some glad." He crossed to where Schuyler stood and placed his arm about his shoulder, and continued: "Good old Jack. Bully for you. You deserve everything that you have ever won. I'd say I loved you like a brother, if it weren't for the fact that I never had a brother yet that I could sit through a meal with without wanting to hit him under the ear with the sideboard." The room had become suddenly dark. Came almost without the warning of preliminary rumble, almost without the precursor of sullen flashing, a great peal of heavy thunder. Schuyler turned. Blake sprang to his feet. Through the bow window the lawn lay dun and dark. Beyond, the Sound, flat and heavy, seemed as gray oil. The Long Island shore had been swallowed in the gloom. Above all was a great black cloud, rimmed of silver and of gold, a low cloud, thick and threatening. And yet to one side and the other, in fact save right in its ominous path, one could see the sunlight on water and on land. Then came the rain, and the wind, and with them incessant flashings, incessant bellowings, wild protest of the outraged god of storms. Trees bent and groaned. Flowers, torn from their tender stalks, lay prostrate in puling puddles. And quick-born waves lashed themselves spitefully against the pier and breakwater down beyond the lawn, unseen in the swirling, screaming wildness of it all. Upon one another Schuyler and Blake turned wondering, amazed eyes. In its suddenness the storm was unbelievable. They stood side by side, gazing out into the storm. Suddenly into the hand of Schuyler stole tiny, frightened fingers. It was Muriel. "I'm frightened, Daddy dear," she cried. Schuyler gathered her into his arms. "Don't be frightened, little sweetheart," he said, soothingly. "It's just a summer storm. Where's Mother?" "Here, Jack." Her voice came from at his very side. "Isn't it terrible? We can't go in this." Holding his child close against his breast, her cheeks against his, her gold-brown hair mixing with the gray of his temples, he said: "Not you and Muriel, of course. But I must. It won't last long. You and Tom can come on a later train. Parks can come with you. There'll be plenty of time. It's only that I have urgent business that I must attend to before sailing." In a swirl of wind and rain, Parks stepped into the room, and, addressing Schuyler, said: "We should be starting, sir." Schuyler nodded. The butler was holding his coat in readiness. He thrust his arms within the sleeves, and with a shrug of broad shoulders stood prepared for departure. Lifting the little girl that was his own, and of the woman he loved, he held her for a brief moment tight to his breast. In her little ear he whispered, "Bye, little sweetheart." She clung to him, little hands about his neck. He set her down again upon the floor. She ran to Blake, waiting. The deep lids of Kathryn were veiling the violet eyes moist and very soft. There was a little tremor of the sensitive lips. Schuyler drew her to him so that she faced him, and whispered. Au revoir, big sweetheart. Don't you dare cry. I know how it hurts. But be a brave little woman. I'll make my stay just as short as possible." "You'll cable?" she asked, tremulously. "Cable?" he repeated. "I'll keep that wireless snapping all the way across. Now let me see you smile." She tried. It was a wan, sad little smile, a smile that was close of kin to a tear. She clung to him for a moment. Then her fingers loosened their hold. She stepped back, white teeth holding nether lip. It was bitterly hard. He looked, and with more understanding than many a man might have, turned swiftly. Parks stepped forward. "Shan't I go with you?" he asked. Schuyler shook his head. "No," he returned. "Come with Mrs. Schuyler. Meet me at the boat. I'm going alone." He thrust open the door. Came a wail of wind, a swirl of rain. And then, as he crossed the threshold, the very heaven itself seemed to be reft apart with a great wild flash of lightning. The roar of the thunder was appalling. Schuyler started back. He forced a laugh. "Were I a superstitious man," he remarked, "I might take that for an omen." And then he was gone. Chapter 14. Young Parmalee and the Woman. He came slinking down the deck of the liner, furtive of eye, uneven of tread. A young man he was, and yet old. For while his body told of youth, his face bespoke age, the unnatural forced age, the hothoused growth of they who live in the froth of life, in the froth that it is hard to tell from the scum. He was tall and well set up. His clothes hung well about his body. They were of fine texture and make, yet unpressed, uncared for. He had been handsome, but he was no longer, for the eyes looked forth from hollows in his face. His cheeks were sunken. His lips were leaden. He was unshaven, ungroomed, unkempt. Looking nervously this way and that, he made his way among the jostling throngs to one of the passages. Searching with sunken eyes for a numbered door, he knocked upon it with the knuckles of his left hand. His right rested at his side, covered with a handkerchief of white silk. He knocked, and stepped back quickly. There was no answer. The door remained shut. He stepped forward again, thrusting the door wide open. The stateroom was empty. He turned. Out upon the deck he strode, then, starting back, he concealed himself in the passageway that he had just left. Coming down the deck was a woman darkly beautiful, tall, lithe, sinuous. Great masses of dead black hair were coiled about her head. Her cheeks were white, her lips very red. Eyes heavy-lidded looked out in cold, inscrutable hauteur upon the confusion about her. She wore a gown that clung to her perfectly modeled figure, that seemed almost a part of her being. She carried, in her left arm, a great cluster of crimson roses. Down the deck she came, slowly, as a queen going to her throne. She turned. The man hiding in the passageway confronted her. His eyes were burning as of a fever. His whole body shook. She remained calm, cold, unmoved. At length the woman spoke, half smiling. "You? I thought that we were through." His voice was tense, strained, unnaturally pitched. The words came between clenched teeth. "You did, eh? You thought you'd throw me over, as you did Rogers, and Van Dam, and the rest of them? But it won't work, you vampire!" Swiftly he tore from his right hand the handkerchief that covered it. There was in it a revolver. The bright mouth of the weapon sprang to the white forehead of the woman. Yet she did not start. She made no sound, no movement. The smile still dwelt upon her lips. It was only in the eyes that a difference came, in the black, inscrutable eyes. They gleamed now, heavy-lidded as before. Their gaze was fixed straight into the sunken, hate-lit eyes of the man before her, a man who, but for her, might still have been a boy. She bent forward a little. Her forehead, between the eyes, was now touching the bright muzzle of the weapon. The finger on the trigger trembled, but did not pull. Came slowly, sibilantly, from between the smiling red lips, "Kiss me, my fool." Her eyes still fixed him. The hand holding the revolver trembled more violently. Slowly the mouth of the weapon sank to lips, to chin, to breast. It hovered there a moment, just over the heart. The finger twitched a little. Twitched, but did not pull. It was a finger governed by a vanished will in a shriveled brain. Then, suddenly, the revolver leaped. The finger pulled. With a shrill screech of hopeless, hideous imprecation, a shriek that died stillborn, the bullet pierced flesh and bone and brain, and that which had been a man, that should have been a boy, lurched drunkenly, and lay a crumpled nothing upon the deck. There was blood upon the deck, beside the hem of the crimson gown, near to the crimson heel of her shoe. And the gown was caught beneath the body of the boy that was. She looked down upon him. The smile not even yet had left her lips. With a lithe movement, infinitely graceful, she drew away, disengaging the hem of her crimson garment. A crimson petal from the great cluster in her arms fell upon it, to lie upon the hollow whiteness of the upturned cheek. And that was all. A man that should have been a boy, was gone. Hurrying, horror-ridden passengers found him there, alone. The doctor came, and stewards, and the captain. They lifted him and bore him away. Of those who live in the froth of things, the froth that is often the scum, there were several. One of these knew him. "It's young Parmalee," he informed them. And that was all he knew. That, and possibly some other things that are little. But of the great things he knew nothing. For of these great things God has told us but little. End of chapters 13 and 14. Chapters 15 and 16 of A Fool There Was by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. A Warning. The storm that had come hissing across the Sound did not last long. Its very fierceness, it seemed, was its own undoing. Its frenzy soon passed, and anon the sun shone. The drooping flowers raised to it pitiful, bedraggled little faces, and from the fields rose the burden of incense, moist, fragrant, giving wet thanks of its coming and of its going. Schuyler's farewells had been but tentative. It had been understood that, should the storm abate, Mrs. Schuyler, Muriel, and Blake would follow on the next train, for he himself was forced by the exigency of his mission to reach the city at least 2 hours before sailing time. The car, returning from the trip to the depot, was again called into service. Parks, as well, had waited, and went with them. Reaching the city, Blake's machine, for which he had telephoned from Larchmont, was waiting, and in this they made the journey through the traffic-thronged New York streets to the dock, A route that leads one from wealth to poverty, from respectability to license, from well-doing to ill-doing, and through all that lies between. The dock, beside which lay tugging at her cables the huge liner, was confusion thrice confused. Jolting cabs, rattling taxis, smooth-running private cars, drays, and vans added to the tumult caused by the thousands of hurrying, scurrying humanity. Came the calls of excited passengers, the rumbling of trucks, the Babel-like voices of emigrants, and beyond, the noises of the great river. Alighting from the car at the gangway, they boarded the ship, with its crowded decks. Schuyler's stateroom was aft, in the center of the ship. It lay the first door to the right, as one enters the narrow passageway. To it the little party made its way. The door of the room opposite was ajar. Blake noticed that there lay therein a great mass of crimson roses, scattered amid the toilet articles and accessories of a woman. Passing through the crowds of the deck he had heard, also, the man who knew telling another man, who did not know, of young Parmalee. It had been but a word. But it had been a word that had found fructification and meaning in the sight of a deck steward, with a bucket, mopping up something from the deck, just outside the little passageway. Kathryn and Muriel, seen safely to the room that Schuyler was to occupy, Blake returned and made his way out upon the deck. He stood for a moment by the steward, watching him. Then, very quietly, inquired, "Where did it happen, steward?" The steward, wringing out the mop into the dark water of his bucket, looked up. There were beads of sweat upon his bronzed, wrinkled brow. Yet the day was not warm. "What, sir?" he queried. "Where did it happen?" "What happened, sir?" "Young Parmalee's suicide." Blake spoke quietly, calmly. The steward's eyes shifted. "Suicide, sir?" he said. "Don't know nothin' about it, Governor." Blake pointed to the spot upon the deck. "What's that, then?" he demanded. The steward moved uneasily. "A spot I just been a-cleanin' of, Governor." Blake pointed to the bucket. "And that?" he persisted. "Water, sir." "And—" The steward slowly drew the back of his hand across dry lips, and then, in a swift rush of strangled words, "Blood, Governor, blood. Only a boy he was, sir, and she looked down on him, laying there with his brains spattered on the deck, and she laughed, sir. God, sir, she laughed." He struggled to his feet and pulled his forelock. He said in altered tones, "Beg pardon, sir. But a man can't be a blind machine all the time, sir." There came a call from the stateroom. "Get that bucket away from here, quick!" And Blake turned to meet the wife and child of his friend as they came from the stateroom. "Oh, I do hope Jack won't be late," Kathryn remarked, scanning the decks. Blake, standing between her and the steward, returned with forced lightness. "Oh, he has plenty of time. Half an hour at least. Why, once I lost 50,000 in the market, broke my steering gear running over a fat policeman, was arrested, taken to court, and bailed out, and all within 20 minutes. Jack's got time to squander." There was sadness in the violet eyes. "It will be very lonely when he's gone, very lonely," she mused, slowly. "Well, it will be as lonely for him as it will for you," Blake returned. "Which is a doubtful consolation, but one that most women don't have." Muriel had wandered to the rail. "Oh, I see him!" she cried, suddenly. "There he is! Daddy! Daddy, dear! He's right there on the gangway, right behind that fat lady, the one with the red nose. I'm going to meet him." Sturdy little legs started to follow the summons of impulsive little brain. But her mother detained her. "No, dearie," she objected. "You'll get lost. He'll be here in a moment now." "Not unless he can get by that lady," protested the child. He's "Pocketed is the word you want, Muriel," assisted Blake. He was looking in the direction which the child had indicated. Suddenly he exclaimed: "I see him now. He doesn't see us, though. Possibly he doesn't know where his stateroom is. These boats are very confusing. I'll go fetch him." Blake disappeared in the throngs upon the deck. Muriel turned to her mother. "Mother," she implored. "Yes, dear?" "Why can't we go too, Mother dear?" "We must stay to care for Aunt Elinor." "But she has a doctor and 2 nurses now," protested the child. "But," returned her mother, smiling, "that isn't like one's own family." The child was for a moment sunk deep in thought most serious. "But why must both of us stay?" she asked at length. Then, suddenly, "Mother, dear." "Yes, little sweetheart." "I'll match you to see which one of us goes." Mrs. Schuyler, surprised, smiled. "Why, daughter, wherever did you learn that?" "I heard Mr. Tom and Daddy the other night. They were sitting in the library, and Mr. Tom said, 'I'll match you to see who gets the cigars.' So, Mother dear, I thought that you and I might match one another to see which of us could go with Daddy." Kathryn placed an arm about her, drawing her to her. "Do you want to go with Daddy and leave Mother?" she asked. The child shook her head doubtfully. "No," she said, "not exactly. I want to go with Daddy. I love Daddy. But I want to stay with you, too, Mother dear. Mother dear," she added suddenly. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Wouldn't it be nice if we were both twins? Then half of us could go with Daddy, and the other half of us stay at home with Aunt Elinor." Chapter 16 The Beginning Schuyler came hurrying down the deck, Blake and Parks close behind. There was on his face the smile of great gladness. He placed one strong arm about his wife, the other about his child. "I've some bully news for you, Kate dear. The President has so arranged that I can complete my work and get back to you in less than a month. Isn't that splendid? Just one little month and I'll be back again with you and baby." The child raised her head in protest. "But I'm not a baby now. I'm 6 years old. Mother has to pay full fare for me on the cars. Don't you, Mother?" Schuyler picked her up from the deck, tossing her in the air. "No matter what you may be to conductors, you'll always be baby to Daddy, you little darling," he said, brightly. Then, turning to Blake, with lightness born of great earnestness, "Take good care of them while I'm gone, won't you, old man? By Jove, I'd like to chuck it all, even at the last minute as it is, and stay at home." Facing his wife, child, and friend, his eyes were up the broad deck. Came toward him the woman known as the Man Who Knew, and of young Parmalee. Schuyler's voice died in his throat. Her eyes were upon him. His eyes were upon her. She made no movement. She paused not in her indolent, sinuous walk. Her eyes were upon him, and that was all. Dark eyes, glowing, inscrutable, beautiful with the beauty that was hers. And his eyes were on hers. She turned up the narrow passageway in which lay Schuyler's stateroom. Blake saw, too. He was not of those who live in the froth of things, that froth of things that is the scum. But he was of the world. And they who are of the world have knowledge of all that that world contains, of all, that it is for such that they know. Kathryn looked up at length, anxiously. Schuyler was never abstracted. She prompted, "You were saying, Jack, dear?" Schuyler drew his hand, palm out, across his forehead. Yes, he floundered, trying to marshal his scattered thoughts. "I was saying—" He appealed to Blake, half helplessly, half whimsically. "By Jove, that's strange. What was I saying, Tom?" Blake replied, shortly, "You were asking me to take good care of them." Schuyler nodded. "Oh, yes," he assented. And then, "I don't understand. But you will take good care of them, won't you, old man? They're all I have, and more, they're all I want. Guard them, Tom, for me, as though they were your own." Waiting to take farewell of those one loves is indeed a sweetness tinged with bitterness. And if one loves very, very much, it is sometimes a bitterness tinged with sweetness. Kathryn, lower lip clenched between white teeth, herself unhappy, would have kept that unhappiness, as far as possible, hers alone. There were those on board that she knew. To them she went, for there was still, since time was short, too much of it. Muriel she took with her. Schuyler, in his eyes all the virile love that such as he feels for theirs, watched her vanish amid the throngs. Then, sauntering to the rail, leaned against it. There came into his eyes a look of abstraction, of aberration, of puzzlement. Blake stood watching him, stood for a long time, silent, unmoving. At length he moved to Schuyler's side. "Old man," he said, very slowly, very quietly, very earnestly, "Old man, what's up?" Schuyler turned quickly. "What's up?" he repeated. "What do you mean?" Blake said, still slowly, "There's something happened to you." "Happened?" cried Schuyler. "Something happened?" He laughed. "What could have happened?" "Damned if I know. But something has. I've got a hunch." Schuyler answered, lightly, "Well, you better take it to a doctor and have it diagnosed." He half turned. "It's only my natural nervousness at leaving Kathryn and Muriel, and the importance of my mission. By the way," he asked abruptly, "what was that crowd doing on the dock as I came up?" Blake, selecting a cigarette, lighted it. "Suicide," he said, curtly. Schuyler started. "You say it mighty cold-bloodedly," he asserted. "Where did it happen?" "Here, I believe. Almost where we are standing." "Good God! Who was it?" "Young chap named Parmalee." "What? The boy who's been in the papers so much lately, who disgraced himself and his people for a woman?" Blake nodded, and continued, "Did you happen to notice the woman who passed a moment ago? The one carrying the red roses?" Schuyler bent his head. "I noticed her," he replied, slowly. "What of her?" "The woman." "You don't mean Parmalee?" "Yes, I do." "Because his love was not returned?" "Because," replied Blake, smiling mirthlessly, "it was returned. Did you ever read that thing of Kipling's The Vampire?" "Why, yes, of course," returned Schuyler. Almost everyone's read that." "Do you remember how it goes?" persisted Blake. Schuyler thought a moment. Then, slowly, he recited: "A fool there was, and he made his prayer, even as you and I, to a rag and a bone and a hank of hair. We called her the woman who did not care, but the fool, he called her his lady fair." He broke off abruptly. "A weird thing," he said, as though to himself. "I never thought much about what it meant before." He turned abruptly. "Why did you ask me if I'd read it?" he demanded. "Well," said Blake, flicking the ashes from his cigarette, "there's the fool." He nodded toward the drying spot upon the deck. "And there," he indicated with a backward toss of his well-shaped head the corridor down which had passed the woman, "is his lady fair. I've even heard," he went on, "that she used to call him her fool, quoting the poem. Pretty little conceit, eh?" His jaw, firm, square, set tight. Then, with a touch of deeper feeling, "She murdered that boy just as surely as if she had cut his throat. And the worst of it is that she can't be held legally guilty. Morally, yes. Guilty as sin. But legally—" He shook his head. "The laws that man makes for mankind are a joke." "As sometimes seen," added Schuyler, slowly, "the laws that God makes for mankind. If what you say about that woman be true, she ought to be taken by the hair of the head and dragged through the hell she has built for others." His brows were knitted. He was gazing with unseeing eyes upon the bustle and confusion of the deck below. Blake, eyeing him, remarked quietly, but in tones more light: "However, that's not your job, nor mine, thank God. It would be an eminently suitable recreation for a debonair young man, with a shattered reputation, a cast-iron stomach, several millions of dollars, and no objection to staying up by the year." He turned a little toward Schuyler. "What are you thinking about?" he queried. "Only the fool." "The generic fool of Kipling, or young Parmalee?" "I was thinking of young Parmalee, then." "And the woman?" Schuyler quoted slowly: "A fool there was." "Oh, but," Blake protested, "I wouldn't call him a fool." "Why not?" demanded Schuyler. "He was a fool." "Yes," returned Blake, "but he's dead now." "Bosh!" retorted Schuyler, impatiently. "I've no sympathy with that false sentiment that forbids one to speak the unpleasant truth of a dead person. If a man were a fool while alive, his dying doesn't absolve him of his folly. Young Parmalee's death was a mitigating circumstance, however. He killed himself, which shows that he had some manhood left. But he should have had the decency to choose another place for his self-destruction." He was silent for a moment. At length he went on: "A man is what he is, and he was what he was. His dying can change nothing of his living." He looked up. His wife and child were coming toward him. "Say nothing to them about all this, Tom," he urged. "Certainly not," acquiesced Blake. A steward came down the deck, calling raucously: "All ashore that's going ashore." Kathryn turned to Schuyler. "And now that the time has really come to say good bye," she said, brokenly, "here's something I brought you, Jack." She handed him a little box of glazed cardboard. Wonderingly, he took it. "For me?" he cried, with simulated gaiety. "That's sweet of you, dear heart. Sweeter even than are these." for he had opened it and taken forth the tiny bouquet of forget-me-nots that had nestled in the depths of the moist cotton. "And these are the sweetest itself. But why forget-me-nots? As though I could ever forget you, even for one little minute." There came again the strident call, "All ashore that's going ashore." Violet eyes suffused, Kathryn was clinging to him. "Jack," she whispered. "Jack, I'm afraid I'm going to cry." With infinite tenderness he held her to him. "There, there, sweetheart mine," he said soothingly. "Don't be a silly. Now we'll all go down to the gangway, where the big hugs are. Then I'll rush back here, and we can wave one another good bye, and try to imagine I'm going only over to Staten Island for the afternoon." Came farewells at the gangway. Farewells of tears, of heartaches, of quivering lips and moist lids, of laughter quavering and smiles unreal, of the good handclasp that good men know, the touch of wet, clinging lips. Schuyler came rushing down the deck, keeping to that part of the ship that lay nearest to the dock. From the bouquet that had been given him he plucked tiny, fragrant blossoms, casting them to those that had given, and with them sending cheery words of hope, tender words of parting. He could see them there, far below, straining against the ropes, waving to him. He could see the violet eyes, tear-laden, the lithe, slender figure of his wife in the glory of her perfect womanhood, the sturdy little body of his child, bare-legged, browned, hair tumbled, waving frantically a tiny little square of muslin and shouting farewells at the highest pitch of childish tremble. He could see his friend, the friend such as few men may ever have, and, waving, may pray to hold, broad shoulders protecting wife and child from the pressing throngs. He could hear his voice booming through all the heterogeneous medley of sound. His voice choked. Words that he was crying, words lost in all the confusion of sound and movement, stuck in his throat. Moisture came to his eyes. He turned a little. Came into range of his vision a tiny streak of shifting crimson. He looked. She was sitting there on the deck, she, the woman. She lay back in her chair, long, lithe limbs covered with a rug of crimson and black and dull, dull green. She was dangling gently, sensuously, the great cluster of scarlet roses that she held, now and again bringing them to where their fragrance would reach her delicately chiseled nose, imperious, haughty. They looked startlingly red against her cheek, like blood upon the snow. She was looking at him. There was no movement save the even, languorous swing of the crimson blossoms. Lips, livid red, were motionless, half parted in a little, inscrutable smile. She was looking at him. He forgot. The whistle had been blowing, sounding departure. He had not heard. There was a lull. From afar, shrill, childish voice brought a drifting, "Bye-bye, daddy dear." He did not hear. Her eyes were on his. His eyes were on hers, and seemed to be nothing else. End of chapters 15 and 16. Chapter 17 of A Fool There Was, by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17 In the Night. He had told Parks to come to him as soon as they were under way. There were certain letters that he wished to get off in time to send them back on the pilot boat. Parks found him by the rail, gazing at a tall, darkly beautiful woman reclining in a steamer chair, eyes only visible above a great cluster of crimson blossoms. Parks had spoken to him 3 times before there was forthcoming a reply. Then, slowly, as a man awakening from a heavy sleep, Schuyler had gone with him to his room. He had tried to dictate his correspondence, had tried and failed. There were many mistakes. His thoughts would not seem to coalesce. His mind was not upon what he was doing, nor could he place it there. And Schuyler's was a brain that had always been to him an admirably trained servant, coming when he willed it, doing what he willed and in the way he willed. But today it was a servant sullen, rebellious, recalcitrant. The letters remained unwritten. Nothing was sent back with the pilot, and Parks, wondering, puzzled, and perhaps a bit perturbed, watched the pilot swing down the Jacob's ladder and make across the water toward his craft, with wonderment, puzzlement, perturbation no bit abated. Schuyler paced the deck all that day. Lunch he did not touch. Dinner found him undesirous of food. He was walking, striding up and down, deep in thought it seemed, and yet he had not been able to dictate his letters. Parks wondered yet more. At length he went to his employer and asked him if he were not needed. The answer was curt. It was "No." And never before had Parks been answered without a cordial nod, or, perhaps, the good smile of good fellowship. He could not understand. And Schuyler? His brain was in a tumult. Like us all, there were many things that he did not know. There were many things that he did not even know there were to know. Some of these he was beginning to learn. It had shaken him, it was shaking him, to his soul. He did not see the woman again that day. Her room was across the corridor from his. He heard her voice, directing the steward to bring to her dinner. It was dark that night, dark as night seldom gets in the northern latitudes in June. The lights of the deck looked like vigorous glow-worms. The stars seemed very far away. Far below, as he paced, he could see a dimly great blackness that was the sea, and against it the white of the waves as they broke sullenly against the huge hull. Later it became yet more black. The stars vanished. The ship seemed a world of its own, hurling through an eternity of utter, deadly space. A wind sprang up, a wind from the east, wet and vicious. A wind that spat upon one, that chilled one, that slapped one with clammy fingers. Schuyler paced the deck. Coming out of the dim half light of the promenade into the corner of the rail, by the bow, he thought he saw her. He was not sure at first. Then, though his eyes pierced no more clearly, he was sure. He went closer. She stood there, white hands clasping the bare rail, lithe, sinewy, lazy body tilted a bit backward as though in the grasp of the spitting wind. Her throat was bare to it, and her breast. Her lips were parted. Her eyes were deep-lidded. Her head was poised like a tiger lily upon its stalk. He stood there, enveloped in the blackness. For a long time she stood motionless. Then she stretched her white arm above her head, stretched the long muscles of her body as a panther stretches. She was very, very beautiful. He stood watching. The ship lurched. It reeled against a huge wave, shivering it into roaring spume. The wet fingers of the wind had wrapped her garments about her, every fold tight against her rounded body. She stood, arms above her head, lips parted, silhouetted against the foam. The ship reeled again, and there came darkness utter. When again there was light so that one might see, Schuyler stood alone. 6 bells had struck ere he went to his room. Then, scourged of body, scourged of soul, racked, harassed, torn, he sought his berth. But he did not sleep. He thought of Parmalee, the boy who was a man. He thought of the woman. He thought of himself. He thought of the wife that he loved. He thought of the child that he loved, the child that had come to him through that wife. He thought of all these things, and of many more. And he did not understand. He did not know. For God has shown even the wisest of us but little of this world in which we live. End of chapter 17. Chapters 18 and 19 of A Fool There Was by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. White Roses. It was 2 months later. In the little garden that lay on the side of the big, rambling house at Larchmont, where the son best loved to dwell, roses were in bloom, and roses, even as the sun, seemed to love that garden. They clustered, great masses of glowing white, against the latticed arbor. They caught playfully at one's hat as one would walk through the gate that led to the broad green lawn, and to the Sound beyond. They snatched at one's clothing as one would walk past the largest bush, the one that stretched its branches across the French window. It was a real garden, an out-of-door home, a garden in which one might live, and in which one might be glad that one was alive. At one side of a tiny writing table, set upon the thick, carpet-like sward, sat the mother, pen in hand, before her a half-finished letter. Across from her the child pressed strong white teeth into the yielding wood of her pencil, and before her, too, was a half-written letter, a sprawling, uncertain letter of childhood. At length the child looked up. She could see that her mother was not writing, so if she spoke she would not be interrupting. "Mother, dear." "Yes, honey." "How do you spell love?" "Don't you know, dearie?" The child shook her head. "L," prompted the mother. Muriel ventured dubiously, "L-A." Her mother shook her head. The child ventured again, "L-I?" "No, honey." The child kicked her little brown legs. "Tell me, mother dear," she besought. "Please tell me." "L-O-V-E," spelled the mother. "Oh, yes, I remember now. Mother dear." "Yes, little sweetheart." "When is Daddy coming home? It's awfully hard to write letters. He's been gone a long time now, hasn't he, mother dear?" "Yes, dearie, a long, long time." The violet eyes were sad. "Most a year?" persisted the little one. Her mother smiled a little, wanly. "It seems like it, doesn't it?" she said. "But it's only 2 months. Not only 2 months," she corrected, "but 2 months." Came a little pause. It was broken again by Muriel. "Mother, dear." "Yes?" "Can't I make the rest just kisses?" With a smile of infinite love and tenderness, the mother leaned across and kissed the child that was hers. "Of course you may, dearie," she assented, softly. "Why don't you write kisses, too, mother dear?" queried the little one. "It's lots easier. Oh, mother dear, I'll tell you what I wrote if you'll tell me what you wrote. Will you?" Violet eyes gave loving assent. Oh, goody. We won't tell anyone else, will we?" "No, dearie." "Then," declared Muriel, "I'll read mine." She picked up the wrinkled little sheet of sadly irregular chirography. "Dear Father Daddy," she read. "It rained yesterday. Mother and I are well. We hope you are well, and God gave our new cat 4 kittens." She looked up into the face of her mother. "God is awfully good to cats, isn't he, Mother dear?" she asked. She went on, then, with the assurance of childhood. "Please come home. We miss you. I fell in the lake yesterday, but didn't take cold. I love you, and the rest is just kisses." She eyed her mother anxiously. "Do you think Daddy will like that letter?" she asked. Her mother's voice was a bit uneven as she answered. "I'm sure he will, little sweetheart. I'm sure he will." "Now," requested the child, "you read yours." Kathryn, drawing the child to her, bent forward. There was much in her heart, much that she might not tell to anyone of all the world, save 2, and one of these was far away, and even though the other could not understand, still. She read: "My John, you know how we love you, but you don't know how we miss you. Please, please come back to us. If it weren't for Muriel, I don't know what I'd do, John dear. I don't want to make you unhappy. I want you to have all the honors, all the prominence, everything that a man's heart holds dear. But I can't help being jealous a little of the things that are keeping you from us." She ceased, turning her head away. A robin, in the roses, lifting its head, broke into song. The child waited patiently. At length she inquired, "Is that all, Mother dear?" Kathryn nodded. "Yes, honey." "Haven't you made any kisses?" "No, dearie." "But," protested the child, "Daddy'll be so disappointed." "Will he, honey? That wouldn't do, would it? Very well, then. Mother'll make some kisses." With Muriel looking on, the mother made several large and heavy crosses at the foot of that which she had written. There were other marks on that letter, marks that were not kisses, marks that had been made by moisture, and that had smeared the ink as they had been quickly wiped away. These the child did not notice. She was looking toward the house. "Here comes Aunt Elinor, Mother dear," she said. Chapter 19. Shadows. Mrs. Van Vorst had been very ill. A fever, contracted in South Africa, where she had been with her husband, a fever gained in a futile effort to save the life of that husband, had sadly fagged a naturally vigorous constitution. There had been a recurrence soon after her return to America. Now she was in that condition of indolent convalescence that is in women so interesting, in men so uninteresting. She was an out-of-door woman, tall, lithe, willowy. In the rugged health that was normally hers, she seemed muscled, almost like one of the opposite sex. Yet she lost by it none of the charm of frank femininity that was hers. She was long-limbed, clean-limbed, quick of mind and of body. The forced inaction of illness was irksome to her. It was hard for her to walk slowly. It was hard for her to sit in silent inaction, to lie in indolent unrest. Too, she felt more than any one save herself might ever know the loss of the man that had been to her not only husband, but as well friend, companion, and comrade. She had been of the world, though anything but worldly. She knew, perhaps, more than many another of the hidden things. She strolled forward through the sun-flecked garden. A magazine, its leaves still uncut, was in her hand. She sank into a chair, in a spot from which she might see the Sound and its burden of sails. "Tom come yet?" she asked. Kathryn shook her head. "Not yet." "Heard from Jack today?" Again Kathryn made negation. "The foreign mail hasn't come yet," she said. "I told Pierre to stop at the office for it." Elinor, selecting a paper knife, ran it slowly between the pages of her magazine. "That business of his seems to be keeping him a long time," was her comment. "What did he say in his last letter?" "Why, there are several matters of great importance that still remain unsettled. It's not a little thing, his mission, you know. I don't know much about such things, but diplomatic questions, it always seemed to me, take years and years of all manner of serious discussion and weighty argument." Kathryn tried to speak lightly, yet the heaviness of her heart was pitifully apparent. Elinor was scanning a colored frontispiece, a thing of vivid yellows and brilliant blues. "You're feeling almost like yourself again, aren't you, Nell?" Elinor nodded. "Yes," she replied, "thanks to you." "You were very ill." "One more doctor would have finished me." Of a sudden there came from the drive the quick honking of an automobile horn, together with the soft purring of an engine. Muriel leaped to her feet, brown little legs flashed as she made her way across the garden. Kathryn and Elinor watched her going. They heard her cry, "Oh, Mr. Tom!" Another moment and Blake, carrying the child in his arms, thrust aside the bending heads of the white roses and made his way into the garden. "Hello, folks!" was his greeting. "Is God in?" "Who?" demanded Elinor. "God," he returned. "This is heaven, isn't it? It certainly does seem like it to anyone who has just come from the fireless cooker that sometimes rejoices under the name of Manhattan. My old Aunt Maria. But it is hot there, though." "We're very glad to see you, Tom," Kathryn began, "although we do owe you a scolding." "What for?" he demanded, setting the child to the sward and taking off his hat. "You haven't been near us for a fortnight." He seated himself, mopping his forehead. "Business, Kate, business," he declared, importantly. Elinor laughed in pleasant irony. "Business," she repeated. "I said business," he retorted. "Yes," she rejoined. "But you can't prove it." "Can't, eh?" he inquired. "Well, you go back to the wicked metropolis, and you'll find that my rent is paid, and that a coupon's been cut from one of my bonds. And who did it, I'd like to know?" "Oh, your secretary, or the janitor, or somebody," returned Elinor, easily. "Not you." Tom laughed. "I must have a very negligible reputation for industry in this menage. How do you think I spend all my time?" Elinor, arms akimbo, half faced him. "Well, Mr. Bones," she asked, "how do you spend all your time?" He grinned at her friendlily. "Feeling better, aren't you?" "I feel so well," she returned, "that if this doctor of mine weren't such a Simon Legree, I could play you 18 holes of golf for a box of gloves against a box of cigars." "Gambler," he scoffed. "And if I should win I suppose I'd have to smoke the cigars." "Certainly," she countered easily, "if I should have to wear the gloves." He sank back in the big chair. "Well," he asserted, "it were useless to speculate on that which may never be. I am at present in that interesting state of a man's career where golf doesn't belong. A man who is beyond the first flush of adolescence and not yet in the last pallor of senility, has no business dallying with golf. He's liable to get sunstruck." Muriel, who had been listening with round, wondering eyes, ran to her mother. "What does he mean, mother dear?" she asked. Elinor replied instead, laughing. "Nobody knows, Muriel. Not even he." "Now that's unkind, Nell," protested Blake. "Unkind, though true." The child, eyeing them for a minute in serious non-understanding, recurred with the facility of the very young to other things. "Oh, mother dear," she cried, "we forgot to stick up our letters to Daddy." Taking her mother's hand, she led her to the little table. Elinor, left alone with Blake, turned to him and queried, "Heard from Jack lately?" He shook his head. "Not lately. Not since I've seen you." "Not enjoying himself much, I suppose," she commented. "He always stuck to this place in summer like a barnacle. Was crazy about it." Blake, sitting with left fist in right palm, eyes upon the velvety green of the lawn, shook his head slowly. "He shouldn't have left a home like this if they'd offered to make him Queen of Sheba," was his comment. Kathryn had turned to him. There was in her eyes a frank gladness, a sincere welcome. She was glad to see him, how glad she herself scarcely knew. She had few friends, for there were but few people for whom she really cared. She had known Blake for many, many years, known him and liked him, and liking, had respected. He was of the few men whom money and bachelorhood have no power to spoil. And they are few indeed. The one has power to spoil, you know, even as the other, and both together, unusual indeed is the man who can resist. "It's good to see you again, Tom," she declared. "It's been lonely here, and I never thought that would happen." "It's good to be here," he returned, looking steadily upon her. "It's good to be here, Kate. It's a perfect place, this. Perfect." Elinor had risen. Plucking a bending blossom, inhaling of its delicate fragrance, she had wandered through the broad archway of the arbor, toward the sound. There was a moment of silence. There came from between Blake's lips a deep sigh. Kathryn looked up quickly. "What's the matter, Tom?" He shook his head again. "I don't know. Sometimes things go all wrong, dead wrong, and no one can tell you why, or how, or what to do." "Why, Tom!" she cried. "What do you mean? Has anything—" "Mean?" he interrupted. "Oh, nothing. Nothing, of course. I guess it's loneliness. There are a lot of people who think because I have a motor to smell, a yacht to make my friends seasick, and a club window to decorate, that I'm contented with my lot. But at heart I'm the most domestic individual that ever desecrated a dinner coat. And sometimes the natural tendencies of the gregarious male animal will not down. There's too much of the concentrated quintessence of unadulterated happiness lying around here. Maybe that's it." "We have been happy here, Tom. Very, very happy." Then quickly, "I'm sorry, Tom. I understand, and I'm sorry." He smiled. "It's nothing, Kate," he declared. "Nothing at all. You've got to expect a bachelor to kick every once in a while, you know. They're a peevish lot of old guys." End of chapters 18 and 19. Chapters 20 and 21 of A Fool There Was, by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. A Fairy Story. Toward the child of his friend, and of his friend's wife, Blake felt not as men in his place would have felt. The love that he had for the dainty little thing of gold-brown hair, and gold-brown cheeks, and straight, sturdy little legs was the love of a man for his own. It seemed to him, almost, that she was flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood, bone of his bone. It was the "almost" that hurt, for she was the child of the woman he loved, and of another man. To love the wife of another man is a bitter thing, a bitter thing. To love with dishonor is not hard, but to love with honor were hard indeed. To go away, so loving, were to render more easy to bear the thing that must be borne. To stay, to see day by day the happiness that lieth beyond hope, were to stand in hell and gaze at heaven. And this were most bitter, most hard of all. Yet this was what Blake had done. This was what Blake would do, and it was what he expected to keep on doing until there was no such thing as time and the souls of all men were dead. He did it because all that lay for him in life lay there, even though not the tiniest bit of it could he claim for his own. And he was a man of heart as well as of head and honor. Perhaps it was because he had loved the woman who was the wife of his friend, since the day when she was as her daughter was now, that his love for the little one that was of her transcended all else in his being, all else save the one thing that he never mentioned, not even to himself. She had been like that. A dainty, pretty, loving, simple, naive, sturdy, rugged little thing, with wind-blown hair, and sun-tanned cheeks and legs, soft, gentle, infinitely appealing, generous, loving. In the little one that was of her, he saw her again, violet-eyed, glowing with a glorious abundance of vigor, building wondrous castles of blue beach clay, counting the soaring gulls against the soft blue of summer skies, wandering, laughingly, through daisy fields, rolling, a whirling little tumult of lace and ribbons and wildly waving bare legs down the stacks of fragrant hay. She had been like that. Small wonder that on her child he lavished all the choked tenderness that cried, sometimes, so piteously for outlet. And as for the child, way down deep in her little heart, she had builded of the infinity of her love 3 sky-reaching heaps, each one bigger, and more wonderful than the other. One of these she gave to her mother, one to her daddy, and one to Mr. Tom. And she deemed herself not undutiful nor lacking in filial amity for so doing. Kathryn had followed her sister into the house. Left alone with Blake, Muriel ran swiftly to him, bounding to his knee, and clasping around his neck strong little arms. "Mr. Tom," she cried, "you haven't told me a story for 'most a year." He held her to him. "Haven't I, little partner?" he inquired, with infinite tenderness. "Well, that's a grave omission, isn't it? I'll tell you one now." As she sank down contentedly in his lap, and settled her outspreading little skirt primly about her, "What shall it be about?" "A fairy story," she suggested. "A fairy story about a little girl." He sat for a moment, in thought. At length he began: "Well, once upon a time there was a little girl, a fairy princess." "Was she pretty?" "Beautiful. Beautiful as she was good, good as she was beautiful. She was a wonderful, wonderful princess. There was a fairy prince, too," he went on. "A handsome, dashing, a prince that every one loved and admired and honored." She nodded seriously. "Yes," she said. "Go on." Now, in the part of the country, it was called the Land of the Great Unrest, there lived a gnome who was a friend of the prince and princess. Do you know what a gnome is?" Little brows were bent deep in mental flagellation. Then at length, very eruditely, she ventured, "No'm is when you say no to a lady, isn't it?" He laughed a little, then seriously, "That's a different kind of gnome. The kind of gnome I mean is a fat man, with long, thin legs, and a big round body, and a funny face." "Oh, now I know!" she cried. "There is a picture of one in the book that you gave me for my birthday. Only this one had whiskers and a funny cap, like a cornucopia." He nodded. "That's the fellow," he agreed. "That's the kind I mean. Only all of them don't have whiskers, and some of them wear yachting caps, or panamas, or most anything. Well, the prince and the princess loved one another, and they got married." "That was nice." "Yes," he added, "for them, but it wasn't for the gnome. You see, the gnome loved the princess, too." "Did she know it?" He shook his head. "No one knew but the gnome," he returned. "And the prince and princess were very happy. Then a little princess came to live with them, and they were happier yet." "A little princess like me?" she queried, interestedly. "Very much like you," he assented. "And what did the gnome do?" "Why," he replied, "the gnome just went away and lived in a hole in the ground, all alone." "Didn't he ever come out?" "Yes, he used to come out sometimes to tell fairy stories to little girls. But he had to go back again, all alone." She sighed most dismally, and said, "Poor old gnome." "Poor old gnome," he repeated. "And then?" "That's all." "Isn't there any more?" "No." She gazed up at him, disappointedly. "I don't think that's a very nice story," she declared. "Don't you?" he said. "I'm sorry, little partner. I didn't mean to tell you that story. He ceased speaking. Elinor was beside him. He rose to his feet hastily, confused. It was no little thing that he had told. It was a thing that he had never meant to tell. It had come to his lips as a parable because of the way he felt toward the child that was not his, because to her it would never have meant anything, and because of the things inside that had struggled for outlet so long. He wondered if she had heard, and hearing, had understood. He could not tell. She spoke to Muriel. "Run into Mawkins, dear," she instructed. Then, as a child, obedient, scampered from the room, she turned to Blake, thrusting toward him a letter, and concluded, "Read that." Chapter 21. A Letter. Blake took the letter. With its taking there came to him a premonition that the things that he had suspected, the things that he had heard, the things that to him were as unbelievable, as utterly absurd and ridiculous and impossible as might be the vainest imaginings of the vainest, had been proven true. Over the first of the letter he skipped cursorily. At length he found John Schuyler's name. The passage relative to the name was brief. He read it slowly, word by word. Then he handed back the letter to Elinor. She had seated herself, waiting. One knee was crossed over the other, and over the upper her hands were clasped. She was eyeing him keenly, closely, eyes half closed, brows contracted. To her Blake turned. "Well?" he interrogated. "I've known Martha Dale for 16 years. She, Kathryn, and I were children together. I think you knew her, too. She's not the woman to make a charge like that unless it's true." Blake shrugged his shoulders. A great pain shot through his heart. A great numbness clamped his brain. He had heard things himself. He had seen people who themselves had seen, or thought that they had seen. One man he had knocked down. With two more, his good friends, he had quarreled irrevocably. And in his own soul something had told him that it was he who was wrong. He said to Elinor, even as over and over and over he had said to himself, "There's some mistake. There must be some mistake. It's impossible." She eyed him shrewdly. "There's no mistake," she returned. "She talked with him. She saw him with this woman. They were at the same hotel where Martha stayed. And the morning after she came, they left. There's no mistake." "But Jack wouldn't do a thing like that," he protested. "You're a bad liar, Tom. You knew." "No!" he cried. "You did. You know you did. How long have you known this thing and kept it from those who should be told?" "Who should be told?" "Kathryn." "No." "But I say yes," she went on, almost fiercely. "Do you think I'll have my sister, the sister whom I love better than anyone in the whole world, fooled and shamed and disgraced and dishonored by a man like that?" He raised his hand protestingly. "You wouldn't tell her!" he cried. She nodded, jaw set. "I would," she declared. "It would kill her." "Nearly, but not quite. She has too much of her father in her for that. And she must know. It is her right." "And take away her every chance of happiness, and his of redemption?" "Her every chance of happiness is gone, as is his for redemption," she said, bitterly. And then, "He should have thought of these things before he did what he did. There's one thing to be done, and only one. I shall tell her." He remarked, slowly, "The woman's way, to bring suffering where suffering might be spared." She rounded on him swiftly. "The man's way, to stick to the husband and deceive the wife. You men have two codes of ethics, a loose, convenient one for yourselves, a tight, uncompromising one for us. There are no two codes of ethics. Right is right, and wrong is wrong, and there can be no compromise. When a man marries a woman, he owes to that woman every bit as much as she owes to him. Suppose," she went on tensely, "that it were Kathryn who had done this thing, who had lied and deceived where she had promised to love and honor. What then? Would you tell the husband, or wouldn't you?" He considered, and said, slowly, positively, "I'd lie like the devil." She whirled about. "You would?" "I would." "Well, I won't. And," she declared, lips tight pressed, jaw tight set, "I shall tell her." Then from the house came Kathryn, happily, gaily. In her hand there was a letter with a foreign postmark, a letter that from its jagged end had been torn open with eager hands. "A note from Jack!" she cried. "What does he say?" demanded Elinor, tensely, her lithe fingers interwoven. "Oh, terribly lonely," returned her sister. "Trying so hard to finish his work and get back to us. I'm adding a postscript." She seated herself before the writing table. "Do you two want to send any messages?" For a moment, for a long, long moment, did Mrs. VanVorst stand, silent, motionless. All that the thing meant that she was about to do, no one knew better than she. She stood silent, eyes half closed, hands clenched. Blake watched her shrewdly. After a long, long time she took a short step forward. "Kate," she began. "Kate, dear, I have something to tell you." End of chapters 20 and 21. Chapters 22 and 23 of A Fool There Was, by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Again the Fairy Story. Kathryn, busy at her postscript, did not hear. Blake stepped swiftly forward. "No," he whispered. "No." Elinor put him aside. "Kate," she said again. Blake stood for a moment, hesitant. Muriel had come from the house. To her he called. "Come here, little partner." Obediently she came running to him. He seated himself and took her upon his lap. "Do you remember the story that I told you a little while ago?" he asked. She nodded. "Well, there's more to that story. Would you like to hear it?" He did not wait for her answer. He spoke swiftly, surely. Elinor, across the table, eyed him curiously. Kathryn, still writing, was oblivious quite to all that was going on around her. Blake continued. "Well, there came a time when the prince had to go a long, long way off. The princess was very sorry to see him go, and so was the little princess, and they cried. But they were brave princesses, so they didn't cry much. They stayed at home and wrote him letters with kisses in them. And then, well, the fairy prince met a witch, a wicked, wicked witch, and she charmed him, and took him away with her. Now the fairy princess had a sister. She was a good woman, and like all good women, she was hard-headed. The sister heard about the witch, and she wanted to run right home as fast as she could and tell all about it. And that would have made the princess cry, and the prince go away and die all alone." The lids over the violet eyes were blinking. The lips quivered. "I want to cry, Mr. Tom," she complained. "That's worse than the other story." "Ah, but," went on Blake, hurriedly, "the sister didn't tell. She wasn't hard-headed. She listened to the voice of reason rather than that of intuition." "What's that word you just said, Mr. Tom?" "Intuition?" She nodded. He hesitated then. "Why, intuition is a thing that women use for a brain. And," he continued, "by and by the fairy prince managed to get away from the wicked witch that had charmed him, and he came back again to the fairy princess and the little fairy princess, and though of course he had been very, very bad, very, very wicked, he was forgiven, and they were almost as happy as they had been before he went away. Do you like that story any better, little partner?" She was all smiles now. She nodded brightly. "Heaps and heaps and heaps!" she cried. "That's good," he said, as he set her down. Kathryn had raised her head from her writing. "Fairy story, Tom?" she queried, in the half-attention of preoccupation. "Yes," he replied. "Does it end happily?" Ere he could have replied, her thoughts were again of her letter. Blake walked slowly to where stood Elinor. She was toying with a hanging blossom of white, fragrant spreading. Her eyes were moist. Her hand trembled. He asked very softly, "Does it end happily, Nell?" She turned to him. Her lips quivered. "I hope so," she whispered. "Only God himself knows how I hope so." And then she added slowly, "If women were only as loyal to women as men are to men." Chapter 23. Aid. Blake had suspected, but he had refused to believe. Now he knew. And half an hour later the Vagrant, under full head of steam, was surging down the Sound with a great white bone in her teeth and a great fan-like wake spreading huge rollers from her trim stern. She anchored off 34th Street. The launch was ready almost as the chain rattled. Blake's big French car was waiting for him at the pier, and with scant regard for the speed ordinances, it bore him swiftly through the traffic-thronged streets to Lower Fifth Avenue and to the house of Dr. DeLancey. The passing of the years had made but little change in either the good doctor or his abode. His office looked the same, dry and musty. He looked the same, shrewd and kindly. "Come in," he said, with the testiness that in him was cordiality concentrated. "Come in. Don't stand there like a gump stretching my bell wire all out of shape. Come in, come in." Blake entered. "Well," said the doctor, leading the way into his office. "What's the matter now? Sick? You don't look it. If all my patients were like you and the Schuylers, I'd starve to death." He fumbled with an old-fashioned cedar cigar chest. "Smoke?" Blake took the cigar and lighted it. "Well," said the doctor again, "for heaven's sake, what's the matter? Have you become suddenly dumb? You have a tongue, haven't you? If you have, for goodness' sake, use it." Blake answered slowly, "Doctor, it's about Jack Schuyler." The sudden little look of anxiety that sprang to the good old man's eyes showed how much the statement meant to him. "About Jack Schuyler!" he exclaimed. "What about Jack Schuyler? No harm. He's not ill?" "Very, very ill, I fear," Blake responded. "I don't understand it at all. I can't comprehend—" The doctor brought his old fist down upon the scratched top of his old desk. "Will you stop hemming and hawing and shilly-shallying around and come to the point?" he fairly howled. "It's about Jack Schuyler," repeated Blake, slowly. "And a woman." Dr. DeLancey started. He sat erect. "What?" he cried. "Jack Schuyler and a woman? You're a fool. It's ridiculous, impossible, absurd." "That's what I've been telling myself for the past month," rejoined Blake. "But it's not ridiculous, it's not impossible, it's not absurd. Would to God it were." "But Jack Schuyler!" protested the doctor, incredulously. "Why, I've known him since he was born. And I knew his father and his mother and his grandfather and his grandmother before him. Damn, I don't believe it. I don't believe it." "Neither did I," returned Blake. "Neither would I, until—" He told the doctor of the letter that had come, and of that which it contained. In silence the doctor listened, and to the end. There was a pause. Blake continued: "I don't believe I could do anything. I'd lose my head. I want you to go to him, to see if there isn't something that you can do. I'll pay—" The doctor leaped from his chair, wagging an old finger in Blake's face. "Pay!" he yelled. "Pay me for going to Jack Schuyler? You keep your dashed money, my boy. When I want any, I'll ask you for it. Do you hear me? I'll ask you for it. When does the first boat sail?" "It sails tonight, in half an hour," returned Blake. "It's the Vagrant. I'm going, too. I want to be near at hand. Good God!" he cried suddenly. It was almost a wail. "To think of Jack Schuyler, our Jack Schuyler, like that!" The doctor came in from the hall whence he had rushed. One arm was in the sleeve of his coat. His hat was over his ear. He was vainly trying to put his left glove on his right hand. "Well," he blurted, "what are you standing there for like a bump on a log? Why don't you get started? What's the matter with you, anyhow? Come on." He turned and shouted up the stairs, "Mary! Mary! Mary, I say. I'm going away. Don't know when I'll be back. Ask young Dr. Houghton across the street to take care of my patients until I get home. He'll probably kill a lot of 'em, but I can't help that." And still shouting, still fussing with glove and sleeve, he bumbled out the door and down the steps to the waiting car. End of chapters 22 and 23. Chapters 24 and 25 of A Fool There Was by Porter Emerson Browne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Rescue. Blake waited on the yacht in the harbor of Liverpool. It was hard for him to sit idly by at such a time, but he felt that it was best. There was in his soul a great pity, to be sure, a great grief, a great horror, yet there was also too great, deep anger, and a wild resentment. For he loved the daughter of Jimmy Blair, you know, and it was not alone that Jack Schuyler was his friend. It was as well that he was her husband, and the father of her child. So he did not trust himself to go, then, for he knew that all that he might do, Dr. DeLancey could do, and more. Dr. DeLancey went, then, alone. In London he found John Schuyler. He did not announce himself. He bullied and stormed, and finally persuaded those who stood between him and his quarry to let him go unannounced. He did not knock. Instead, he thrust open the door and entered. Schuyler was standing before the grate with its burden of glowing coals. He looked up. He started, rubbing his eyes as one who sees but doesn't believe that which his gaze tells him to be so. "It's you!" he cried. Dr. DeLancey nodded. "Yes," he said simply. "Jack, I've come to take you home. The yacht's waiting at Liverpool. Tom's boat, you know. Steam's up, so get your hat." Schuyler raised his hand protestingly. "But," he began, "I—" The doctor cried, explosively, "Don't you try to argue with me, young man. I've neglected my practice and let everything go to the devil to come over here, and I don't want any of your dashed buts thrown at me. You get your hat and coat, and you come with me. Do you hear me?" "I can't go," said Schuyler. The doctor brought his flat fist down upon the center table. "Can't go!" he howled. "In about a split second I'll show you whether you can't or not. You get your hat and coat, or," he went on, "come without 'em. It's all the same to me. Parks can pack up your things and come on the Transitania tomorrow. You're coming now. Do you hear me? You're coming now, this dashed instant." He advanced upon Schuyler, gripping him by the arm. Schuyler stood for a brief moment, doggedly. Then suddenly his head dropped forward upon his breast. "Very well," he acquiesced, slowly. Suddenly his voice broke. He almost whispered, "I'm glad you've come, Doctor. I was helpless, utterly helpless." They took the train within the hour, and the following morning found the Vagrant at sea, with John Schuyler on board. Yet it was a different John Schuyler from the one they had known. He had refused to shake hands with either Blake or the doctor. He did not mention the woman, nor did they. They tried to be toward him as they had always been, as though all that had happened alone in imagination. He did not sleep. He ate but little, and he drank some. Blake was heartsick, soul-sick. To see the man that he had known and loved as that man was? But Dr. DeLancey assured him, "It'll take a year or two, but he'll be all right in the end." And yet even Dr. DeLancey did not feel certain that it was the truth that he spoke. In crossing, Schuyler spent much time on a long, long letter, a letter that required much rewriting. On landing, he mailed that letter to the daughter of Jimmy Blair. As on the pier he separated from Blake and Dr. DeLancey, in spite of the insistent pleas of the one, and the testy commands of the other, that he come to live with them, he said only, "I shall go to a hotel. I shall stay there a fortnight. Don't come to see me. Don't let anyone come to see me. Don't even try to find out where I am. There's one thing, and only one, for me to do. I'm going to try to do it. Sometime I hope that I may shake hands with you, Tom. Sometime I want to shake hands with Dr. DeLancey. I want to tell you both all that is in my heart to tell you. But that time is not yet. God bless you for all that you've done for me." And, white-lipped, moist-eyed, he left them. Chapter 25. The Return. The library of John Schuyler's townhouse was a large room, done in dull browns and deep greens. All that good taste and a sufficient purse could do to beautify it, to render it alike pleasing and restful to the eye, comforting and satisfying to the soul, had been done. Carpeting was deep and rich. The walls were paneled of mahogany, and the bookshelves sunk into their dull depths. On either side of the door leading to the hall hung a painting, the one a Turner, the other a Correggio. There was a fireplace, a huge fireplace wherein might lie a 4-foot log. Above it a mirrored mantel. Before it the skin of a jaguar. Across from this, a narrow flight of stairs led to the private apartments of the owner. It was early fall now. The roses in the garden of the Larchmont place had withered and fallen. It had been a dun morning, a morning of dull gray. Schuyler sat at the big mahogany desk in the center of his library. Papers lay spread upon the table before him. A decanter of cut glass and silver lay there also. The Schuyler that had come was different, very, from the Schuyler that had gone. He was still quick, agile, alert, but there was gone from his clean-cut face the expression of cheerful optimism, of confident happiness, of all-spreading good fellowship. Little wrinkles had gathered at eye corners, deeper were the lines that ran from nostrils to the end of his mouth. But these changes one might not have noticed were it not for the eyes, for from these the light had gone. They were as lamps unlit. Yet there was one other change apparent. For while before he had concentrated easily upon that which he had to do, now it was with difficulty, almost even with impossibility. He paused often to pour from the decanter a little brandy into a small glass, and to drink that which he had poured. He rose from his chair, to stride nervously up and down, up and down. He seated himself only to drink again. He drank again only to rise again. He rose again only to sit again. He rapped at length upon the little bell that lay upon the table, waited, then rapped again, and his brows creased in petulance. "Now where the devil is Parks?" he muttered, nervously. He waited, and drank while waiting. Then rang again the bell. Even as its mellow note pierced the silence of the room, the door opened and Parks entered. He crossed to the desk and laid upon it a bundle of documents that he had brought. At his clear-cut face Schuyler looked. "Well, here you are at last, eh? Anyone would think that I had sent you to Singapore for those papers, instead of merely upstairs." "I'm very sorry, sir," was Parks's quiet response. Schuyler took the papers, drawing them to him. "That's all," he said curtly. "You may go." "But—" "I said you might go." Parks still hesitated. Schuyler looked at him angrily. "I merely wished to say," Parks spoke deferentially, even soothingly, and possibly a bit reluctantly, "that there is a lady—" Schuyler interrupted quickly. Parks nodded. "Yes, sir, the lady." Schuyler said, eyes closing a little, "A lady? Well, send her." Then, as Parks started to go, "No, tell her I'm not here." "Very well, sir." Again Parks started to leave the room. Again Schuyler stopped him. "Wait. I've changed my mind. I'll see her." He reached for the decanter of brandy, and poured into one of the glasses an even inch of the amber liquor. He raised the glass to his lips, but set it down again untasted, for Parks had started to speak again. "Also, there's a van here for your wife's—pardon me, for Mrs. Schuyler's furniture and trunks." Schuyler's brows contracted. There was the slightest suggestion of a quiver at lip ends. Then, after a long pause, he replied, "Well, let them take all that she selected. And, Parks—" "Yes, sir." "I won't see the lady after all." Parks nodded, and quietly withdrew. Left alone, Schuyler for some moments sat silent and motionless before his desk. But nowadays he could not sit motionless for long. There was that inside his brain, inside his soul, which would not let him. It kept him moving without rest, without cessation. Even as he had paced the deck of the liner, on that other morning, almost until the day had come to claim again from the night that which was his own. Of a sudden he rose from his chair. Swift strides took him across the room. Quickly, nervously, he drew back the curtain from the window. He could see, beneath him on the street, the van that had come for the belongings of his wife, of the woman who had borne him his child, the child which he had not seen since, upon the dock, she had waved him farewell. John Schuyler had wandered into the unknown. Unwillingly, knowing full well what he was doing, but powerless to help, powerless to prevent, he had gone. Sometimes it did not seem real to him. It was a nightmare. A horrid, horrible, awful, gruesome, rotten dream. A dream that brought to his nostrils a stench, to his soul a coldness unutterable, a coldness beside which that of death might seem a grateful warmth. He would wake sometimes from his dreams, a cold sweat enveloping him like a pall, a scream upon his lips. And then, again, he did not understand. He could not understand. It was hopeless, utterly hopeless. Why should such things be? How could such things be? There was a God, presumably. Presumably that God was good. There was no logic in it, no reason in it. What did it all mean? Why? He asked himself again and again, and yet again. Why? There had been no answer. He watched the van load. He watched the heavy horses throw themselves into the traces as the whip fell across their flanks. He watched the van slowly gather momentum. He watched it rumble heavily down the sodden asphalt. At length it turned the corner. John Schuyler swung on his heel. And then he laughed. It was a laugh that, God grant, you may never laugh, nor I. End of chapters 24 and 25.